going. Right. Okay, Garrett, just let me know if you guys can see my screen.
As soon as we see it, we'll let you know. There's nothing coming yet.
Right. I think we definitely have to fly through the session today.
Okay.
Okay. Are you guys able to see anything?
Not yet. Not yet.
Okay, it should be coming up.
It's changing color, yeah? There we go. Well done. Yay!
Awesome. All right. Yeah. Thank you once again, guys. Welcome for another part two. So just a quick scheme of things today. I think we just have to kind of rush a few things going by. So let's just do a recap of what today's agenda is all about. We're just doing a quick recap about what we actually touched based on yesterday, right? So basically, yesterday we spoke about um, all things Python and all things Django, right? So we spoke about what is Python, what is Django. We even spoke about things like Microsoft Azure with the web services. We even spoke about GitHub and Git, right? And then yesterday I was actually talking to you guys about all things web development, what exactly is web development and so forth. So if you guys, I'm not sure, I think within the chats, the links should still be there if I'm not mistaken.
Are they? Yep.
All right, awesome. So if the chats are still there, you guys can just definitely go and make sure that you guys have downloaded all of the links that I've actually pasted in the chats, just so that you guys are ready for today. All right. So without it being said, let me jump straight into today's session. So today's session, I'm going to be talking to you guys about what exactly HTML is, what is CSS. We're talking about the different types of web developments that we had. Because remember, I spoke about back end, front end, and full stack. Then we're going to have a deeper dive in terms of Django. And I mean a deeper dive in terms of really understanding the architecture of Django, right? And then obviously I'll be showing you how to actually build and construct the Python application. And then we'll be starting with the fundamental of HTML as well as the fundamental of CSS. And then we'll wrap it up for today. So guys, please do pardon me. I will be going through a couple of these slides once again. And for those of you guys who don't know, my name is Koketo Mototata. I'm an ISET buddy. Besides that, my profession, I am a web developer, and I'm an ambassador for a couple of these fan companies, tech companies. But overall, I do actually write tech blogs. If you've got any information that you guys want to reach out to, there's my contact details. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and that is my personal website where you guys can actually just see the work that I've actually done in the past. So without further ado, this is not about me. This is all about you guys. So let's jump straight into it. So what is the different types of web developers that we actually found? So remember, I spoke about three phenomenon kinds of web developers, right? So we have a front end, we have a back end, and we have a full stack. So I'm going to be diving a little bit much more deeper into this. But as from tomorrow and on Thursday, I'll be actually breaking down, even going a bit more deeper in terms of the differences, what are the benefits. We'll be even looking at the job markets, and as well as the job opportunities as well. So first things first, let's start off with the front end developer, right? So what is a front end developer? Basically, this is the person that's actually responsible for the look and feel of how a website looks like, right? So when you log onto a website such as www.google.com, the first thing that you see over there is what a web developer, a front-end web developer actually is responsible for. So they're responsible for making web pages, right? So fundamentally, what they would actually need is they comprise of using HTML, they actually use CSS, and they use JavaScript, right? We're not going to be touching too much on JavaScript just as yet, maybe in another session at another time, but primarily you definitely need to make sure that your HTML and your CSS is definitely unlocked and on key, right? So what basically is, and I'll be talking about these two technologies a bit later on in the slides, but these are basically the two tools that you definitely need when it comes to web development, right? Then we go into a back-end developer. So a back-end developer, basically, this is where the server-side rendering comes in. And when I mean server-side, so basically you will see in your Django app, there's something called a server, right? So a server, it kind of acts like a web host or slash database onto your local host, onto your local system, but it's actually for free. So you don't have to pay for it. There's no any configurations for it. There's no actually the tedious work of how we actually used to do things in terms of running a server just for your website to actually run on it is actually now being handled by these technologies that we are using now today. So some examples of backend technologies is actually Django, right? So Django is actually a backend technology, but nowadays it can also be comprised of being a full stack development, and you'll actually see why, because once you start building your Django app, you can actually use it for the front end as well as the back end. But basically, back end actually helps you to actually connect to the database. So if you have a database or you're using an API, so an API basically it's an application programming interface where you can actually access data from different endpoints. So for instance, if I want to get data from Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, I will just use something called an API, which is my website will actually have some sort of communication with that kind of medium. So we usually call those like third-party APIs, but let's not dive into it today. I will definitely touch on it within the coming weeks. And then last but not least, we have a full stack developer. I actually like this picture of this person because this is exactly what a full stack developer does. It actually handles both the front end and the back end capabilities, as well as obviously understanding the things of architectural design, user experience, and so forth. So it takes quite a lot of time and practice for you to become a full stack developer. I personally I would suggest that you actually start off with the front end, then the back end, and in that sense, you have a full understanding of what a full stack development is. So you have different types of actually stacks. So we have something called the MERN stack, the Jam stack, and all of that. But I'll also be explaining all of those terms within the coming days and so forth. So now let's just jump into basic web development. What is HTML, right? So HTML actually stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And basically what this actually happens is this actually helps us to, it's like the building blocks of how our websites are going to look like, right? So when we go into the practical session, you'll definitely understand what and then see how this all actually works, right? And you must understand that in HTML, we have things like headers, we have paragraph tags, we have things like div tags that actually help us, and even sections to help us break down in terms of how a web page is going to actually look like, right? Then we have something, so actually, as I said, what is HTML actually used for? So these are actually, it's like electronic documents, as you can think about it. So think about it on paper, but actually onto your browser, onto your screen. That's exactly what an HTML is all about. It's just a blank piece of paper that you can actually work on. But now it helps you, and it has tools to actually help you build these things called, it's actually called hyperlinks. So in terms of these hyperlinks basically it's different pages, right? So if I'm going from the home page to a contact page, a home page is actually a hyperlink. It's a hyperlink on its own, as well as the home page is a hyperlink on its own. All right. Now let's jump into what exactly is CSS. So CSS actually stands for Cascading Style Sheet. And this basically helps us with making our website look much more professional. It helps us with resizing elements, adding textures, adding colors, adding animations. Basically, it just makes the presentation of the document, which is the HTML document, look much more beautiful. And guys, as I said yesterday, HTML and CSS are like husband and wife. They will always go together, right? In this case, they don't, there's no divorce in this case because they definitely go hand in hand. You cannot use HTML without CSS. All right. So now what is exactly CSS used for? And as I mentioned, it actually helps us to really redefine and helps us to change things in terms of our website, the look, the feel, color palettes. And obviously with time and training, you will see for yourself in terms of learning something called architectural design, or actually web design, in terms of the design aspect of it, and which is something I'm also going to be touching on later within the weeks. All right. So now let's take a deeper dive into Django, right? So remember I told you guys that there's something called frameworks. So framework basically it's like a container or a playground that actually helps you to build these web applications, right? So think about it in terms of if you taking a child to a jungle gym, right? So that jungle gym basically it's a structure on its own. Each jungle gym has their own look, design, feel, right? So same way in web development. So we have something like Angular as a framework, and we have Laravel as a framework, so that uses PHP, which is a backend technology as well. But then we have Django as a framework, which actually it's a different type of a jungle gym that actually helps us to build our web application, right? So typically there's something called the MVC, right? Which actually stands for the model, the view, and the control. So I'll be diving deep into this, but Django actually uses something called the MVT, right? So they actually say MTV, but I just say MVT. So if you can actually, guys, look at the diagram over here, is that we have the user on the left accessing a Django application, right? So this Django application then obviously interacts with something called a URL. So a URL is exactly what it actually sounds like. So that www.youtube, www. So that's the URL that we actually input into our application. What it then happens is Django application will send this URL to its views, right? So what it then does is that this view actually then controls two parts of it. We have the model and we have the template. So as you can see over here, the T over here, it stands for the template. Now you'll see that the C and the V and the T are actually different. So what the view actually happens is this is basically like a traffic officer, right? So this actually helps with flow of requests, flow of traffic, flow of users, and so forth, right? So this template over here, it's basically what everything we are going to be seeing, right? So if I'm going to send a request saying google.com, it's going to send it through to the URL, and then it's going to get to the views. So what views is then going to determine is that, okay, we actually have to display views. Actually, there's actually another connection between the model and the views, because obviously we know that if you're accessing a website that has data, that's what the model view is actually going to handle, right? So think about it that the model view actually handles all the databases, right? And then the template handles all the views. So when I mean views, in terms of everything that you see on the website, right? So this is where your HTML and your CSS will actually be displayed. The view is then actually the controller, right? So this is the person that actually controls the flow, and then you have the URL, which actually helps with actually the routing system, right? So if we actually just look into like basically the definitions, as I said, we have models. Models basically it helps you manipulate with your data. So data, when I mean data, is that this you only use your models if you are going to be connecting to a database, right? So it could be a cloud database such as Microsoft Azure. It could be a typical MySQL. So I mean, Django it's quite popular and powerful in that sense that it can actually use multiple sources of databases, right? So the URL basically, as you can see, it matches the request that we're actually going to send. So when I say www.google/maps, that is a URL. If I say www.google/address, that is a URL. All right. So that is exactly what URL is. And then a template, as I also said, this is what actually happens when we place our HTML and our CSS, and then our views. These are basically, you have function and class-based views, but mostly we actually use class-based views. And this also, as I said, acts like a traffic cop. So they actually handle the requests and run the responses. So when I, as the user, want to access something onto the internet, so if I go back here, so if I, as the user over here, type in www.google.com. It's something called a request. I'm requesting to see a Google website, right? So, and guys, this happens so fast. So as soon as you press enter, the request is now sent throughout all these mechanisms, and it reaches into the Google template, and then it will come back, obviously. So the response, basically, it's what you will then see or gets rendered onto your screen. All right. So it's also quite important when you are in web development to keep track in terms of where you are. So this is basically what our timeline. So we have something called a timeline. Others call it sprints. In professional level, they call it sprints. We can even call it deliverables. But it's basically generic small steps that actually help us to actually reach our ultimate goal. So step one is obviously we are going to be building our Django application. Second step is that we'll be building our HTML and CSS. Thirdly, we'll be then transferring or pushing our code repositories or files to GitHub using Git. And then last but not least, we will be obviously hosting our website onto Microsoft Azure Web Services. Right. So so before I actually jump into some code snippets, I'm going to be just telling you guys in terms of how to actually start a Django application, right? So there's actually 3 main steps that I'm going to be showing you guys how to create your Django app, right? So by now, I'm really hoping that everybody has already got Python installed, because we are going to use the command line to actually install Django, because Django is actually it's a pre-installed package that Python actually has. Then we're going to just create our application, and then we're going to run the server, right? And if you guys want more information, here's a link down below that you guys can definitely access all the documentation on Django in terms of deeper understanding. All right. And I think that actually brings me to the end of the presentation session. I know I really went quite fast in this session, but for now, if there's any questions, if there's anything you guys are not quite sure of, I'll just open up the window just for 2 minutes before we actually jump into the practical session. So if there's anyone that has any questions, feel free to jump in.
Doesn't look like there are any questions, Koketso. It's not even any hands.
All right, so I'm hoping then everybody. All right, I'm hoping everybody can understand. Guys, as I said, if you don't understand, please don't be shy to ask a question or you're not sure about something, because it's really, really, really important that you understand where I'm coming from and so forth. All right. So that being said, I think we can just jump straight into the session. Okay, guys. So for the practical session, I want everybody to actually open up the VS Code, right? So hopefully, remember yesterday I did say, guys, please make sure that you install your VS Code. So I think right now is the perfect opportunity for everybody to open up the VS Code. All right. So I'm just gonna open mine. Okay. Just let me know you guys can also see my screen once again. All right, guys. So basically what I'm going to show you right now is that I'm just quickly going to show you how actually HTML and CSS actually works, right? Before we actually jump into like the serious coding of our application. So I'm just going to be, showing you a few things, a few tricks that you guys, just so that you actually can understand what the how HTML and CSS communicate with each other. All right. So you guys see my screen? No.
No.
Okay. Can you guys see my screen? No? Okay, guys. So while that is opening up, I'm just gonna quickly run in terms of just an example, so you guys don't actually have to do anything just as yet, right? So I'm just actually going to show you and explain to you basically the structure of how a web application actually works. I think my VS Code is, yeah, it's loading an old project of mine. Okay. So what I will then do is I'm going to give you basically a rundown in terms of how a structure, and actually for you guys to really familiarize yourself with the code, right? So basically I'm just using Notepad++. It really doesn't matter for now because I just want to really show you guys the structure of how everything works, right? So as I said, I'm going to be teaching you basically literally from scratch in terms of how to actually start building your website, right? So what you usually want to do is that you actually want to create a folder, right? Just a dummy folder that you just want to use, just so that obviously your project files can all be in one place, right? So what I'm then going to do is I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm just going to, let's see, just give it a name. I'll just say example, right? All right, cool. So then, so basically, guys, Notepad++ is also a text editor. Remember, I did mention that on VS Code actually helps us to actually type our code, just as well as Notepad++. But this one is just for quick projects, nothing too hectic. So now the first thing I want to talk to you guys is basically the structure, right? The structure of how a web page actually looks like. So usually there's three things that you actually need to remember, right? So the first things first is that you always want to make sure that in HTML, okay, I can zoom. Is this much better? Can you guys now see? Can you guys now see?
Yes. Sorry, I couldn't unmute that quickly, Koketso.
All right, not a problem. All right, guys. So, right. So, the first things first in HTML, guys, this is what we call tags, right? So, greater than, smaller sign is tags. You are going to see tags everywhere on your HTML page, right? So this is mandatory. It's key. You will never run away from it. It's always going to be there, right? So it's really important that you understand this. So this tag actually tells the browser that this is what we actually, so in the background somewhere, this is actually interpolating or translating what we are actually trying to say on our text editor that will be displayed onto our browser. All right, so the first things first is that we actually need to have some sort of declaration, right? So this is what we call a doc type, right? So a doc type, basically it's the type of file that we're going to be using. And what exactly are we going to be using? We're using an HTML file, right? Now, the first things first is you always want to open. So this is what we call opening your tag, right? So this is HTML. And this is how you close your tag, HTML. So this backslash over here, basically what this means in HTML is that I'm going to read everything inside of here and I'm going to stop all the way until here. So when I open the tag on line 3, and I'm going to close my tag in line 5, and I'm going to then code everything inside over here, right? So now you will see that most of the time, you guys also have to be very aware of your shortcut keys, right? So when I mean shortcut keys is that how to paste, how to save, how to undo, and so forth. So first things first, you obviously want to save this file. So a shortcut key to save is you can actually hold Control S or Command S if you're using a Mac. And what this will then do is it's automatically going to save your work.
We can hear you.
Okay. All right. So as I was saying, I'm just waiting for my system just to actually behave. Today.
Okay, so maybe just explain what you're doing.
All right, so yeah, right now I'm just saving this my work, right? So I was actually telling you guys that it's quite important for you to actually always save your work. So I'm just okay. There we go. Finally. All right, so remember I then created that example folder, right? So you always want to make sure that all your projects are in one folder, right? So this is quite important, especially when you will see that when we push our project onto GitHub as well as onto Microsoft, right? Because remember, it deals with folders and containers, right? So a folder basically is just a container that contains all of our information inside. So basically how you actually save your HTML file, right? You will always want to save your HTML file as index.html, right? So the extension over here is the .html, which is quite important, right? So usually some developers might say home.html or contact. So depending on the amount of pages that you actually have in your application, you always have to give it a specific name, and then you always have to use the dot extension file, right? But now the difference is with HTML and CSS, you will generally always have one CSS file, right? The CSS file, you always have to then link it to all the other HTML pages, right? Because remember, HTML helps us with the structure of the website, right? So my home page is going to be different from my customer page, is going to be different from my product page, right? But my CSS file is going to contain all the stylings of how my website is actually going to be and look like. All right, so basically what I'm actually trying to do here is I'm going to be showing you guys how to actually access a few things. So let me just copy this image in there.
I think you're losing us, Keketso.
Is my network cutting all the time?
No, it's just nothing is happening.
Okay. Okay, I think, can you guys now see? All right, so as I was saying, this is how you actually save your files, right? So it's something called index.html, right? You'll always use this this extension. So let me just save it inside of this example folder. And let me just save. Right. Then when you save, you should actually start seeing the color change in my text editor over here. All right, there we go. So what this blue actually signifies, I mean, every text editor is quite different, right? So I mean, this you'll see in VS Code when we actually start with the real code, it might look different from yours to mine and so forth. So then what you want to then do is everything inside of my HTML file is then going to be rendered out into my web browser. All right. So when I mean render, it just think about it in terms of it's just going to show. All right. Right. So now in our web page, we actually divide our web page into 3 different categories, right? We have something called the head, right? So remember, guys, every time I open a tag, I always want to close a tag, right? So that's my head. Then I have something called the body, right? So I open my tag and I close the tag, right? And last but not least, I have something called the footer. So I'd like to always think about it. Think about your web page as like a human anatomy, right? So when I mean a human anatomy, think about it like a human. Every human has a head, every human has a body, and every human has feet. And this is quite important because there are certain information that we always want to make sure that are inside the head, and there's certain information that we obviously want to keep inside the body, and certain information that has to keep inside of the footer, right? So to actually see if our website actually works, let's actually write some code in here, right? So I'm going to actually have something called a h1 tag, which is actually called a header tag, right? So h1 tags basically helps us with writing headers, right? So I'll just say, hello everyone from iSet, all right? And let's also just put a paragraph tag. So guys, these tags obviously you with time you actually get to know, and you'll be quite proficient in terms of how to remember all of these tags with practice, and you'll just say, this is my first website, right? And I save that. So now, once again, guys, the body tag is quite important because this is where we actually work or have majority of our code, right? So this is where all of the paragraph tags, all of the header tags, all of the images, the paragraphs are going to be included in here, all right? So now let's see what actually happens in terms of our browser, right? So remember I had this folder called example, and I have, as you can see, guys, it's called an index, right? So if I double click on index, you will then see my browser is gonna already start spinning up. And then you'll see all right, so now it's going into my browser. And even if you check the URL, right, it actually shows us where this page is actually rendering from. So this is basically typically how URLs will actually work in Django. And as you guys can see, there it is, and it's now rendering onto my browser over there. Right. So how cool is that? So now let me just expand and actually let me show you. You can actually do a number of things, right? So let me just put an H2 tag over here. Always remember, guys, whenever you open your tag, you always want to close your tag. Now, in VS Code, there's actually an extension that can actually help you with all of this, but it's quite important that I want you guys to get used to actually physically typing it in so that you don't have any mistakes. Because if, for instance, I do not close my tag, let's say, for instance, do we still have time? Okay. For instance, if I forget to close my tag over here, right? And if I save my work, and if I go back to my browser and I press refresh, you will then see that my website is actually looking quite funky. But I only wanted the first line to be in bold, but now my second one is also in bold. Because why? If we had to look our code, we actually didn't close this tag. So what HTML is actually saying is it's taking everything from this line and seeing that, oh, okay, you guys didn't close. Oh, but it's a paragraph tag, but it's still in bold and it's going to carry on, right? So in that case, it means I just have to close my tag, right? And we can also, we can have different sizes. So as I said, H tags has H1, H2, H3, all the way to H6, right? So you can just say, this is my second header. And we can just say H6. This is a header, right? And I close my tab. Right. So as I said, guys, in HTML, these are quite common properties that you will definitely have to learn and you have to master and keep practicing, right? Keep practicing, you'll definitely get the hang of it. So when I go back to my browser and I press, so a shortcut key to always, because remember, you always have to save your work to actually see the updated work. So as you can see right now, there's nothing really happening onto my browser. So if I hit refresh, you will then see there are now changes onto my onto my website. All right. So now you're probably asking yourself, okay, cool. Okay, so then how do I now start manipulating and actually changing things into my website? I mean, as you guys can see, this does look kind of boring, just black and white. And obviously, this is not how websites actually work, right? So then what we then is then going to do is, let me just make some space. So I'm going to create another file, right? So this file is then what we will call our CSS file. Now, the difference between HTML and CSS is that they actually use different syntax. So syntax meaning the way you actually write code, right? So with CSS actually uses normal convention in programming styling. So it uses things like semicolons and curly braces, right? So first things first is that we are going to use the star key, right? So this star key means that apply this to every single web page. But for now, we are going to be stressing and focusing on one page. But I want you guys to actually take a look at something real closely. As you can see right now, our H1 tag and our paragraph tag, it's got spaces in between. There's like spaces there at the top, there's spaces there on the side, which is not ideal when it comes to web development, because with web development, you have to be quite precise in terms of where you want to put your elements and so forth. So this access space actually is not a good idea. So what we then have to do is we actually need to remove all of this, all right? Okay. So then what this means is that I want you to, so this is telling CSS that I want you to take all the padding, right? So the padding actually just means the spacing, right? And apply 0 to it. I want all the margins, right, to actually have 0. So we're actually telling CSS to actually remove all of this stuff, right? But I first have to, obviously, as always, have to save my work. And in this case, and always make sure that your CSS is always in the same main folder as your HTML, because if I actually inspect and check all my files, my HTML should be there, which is, as you can see, it's indexed. All right. So with my CSS, we actually call it style.css, right? And we save that. As you guys can see, the color will also change. So if I press save and we go back into my browser and I press refresh, you guys can see that obviously nothing is happening. But you're asking yourself, why is that so? Reason being is that we actually have to tell CSS and HTML that they have to actually connect and link with each other. So how do we then do that? Now there's something called a link tag, right? So this link tag, right? It's a special character because remember I always used to tell you that every time you open a tag, you must close the tag. Link tag actually works very different. You don't actually have to have a link tag, right? So this is what we call one of those special cases where HTML just doesn't and you'll see there's actually quite a number of other properties that you will encounter where you will see that you don't always have to open your tag and always have to close your tag in the sense. But right, so this is perfectly fine as it is. I mean, some people actually do include the link tag, but it's not really that necessary that much. But as you go, so then we actually need to tell HTML that, hey, I need you to go and look for my CSS file, right? So what we then have to do is we have something called a
Kitsa, we've lost your running commentary again.
Oh, I think I was actually. I think I accidentally pressed. Okay, so you guys can hear me now, right?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
All right. So as I mentioned, this is what we call a link tag. Now you actually need to tell HTML that you need to go and actually fetch my CSS file, and this is what we call an href, right? So it gives a reference in terms of telling CSS that I need you to go fetch my style.css folder, right? And what basically this actually just means is that we just need to just give it the right naming conventions in terms of remember, this is a style sheet. So it's a style sheet. And you can also just add a type, but this is not really important. But it does get really important when it comes to working with bigger projects and other libraries because it will get confusing. But as I said, it's best if you guys get into the habit of just learning the syntax of how the structure actually works. So what this actually just means, this on line 6, it actually just means that this is when when HTML reads the folder, is that just make sure that you go and collect my CSS file. As you guys can see, my CSS file is over here, right? And it is considered as my style sheet. So if I save my work and I go back into my browser, and as soon as I hit refresh, Now you guys can see that now everything and all of the spaces is now gone. Awesome. So that's exactly what we actually want. So now we know that my HTML and my CSS are now communicating with one another, right? So now you're probably thinking, okay, so now I know how to actually link both of my files. Now let's actually start doing some really cool stuff with this text, right? So let's take the first H1 and the first P tag together, all right? So what we then can say is that, how do I then tell HTML that I actually want to style it in my CSS? Because remember, guys, CSS helps us to style, helps us to modify, and helps us to change things in our code, right? So there's something called classes, right? So this is what I mean by a class. This basically tells equals, this class actually is associated with CSS, right? So as I remember, as I said, CSS actually follows the naming convention of a typical programming language. So right, so in programming, you obviously know about a term called OOP, which is object-oriented programming, and objects and classes are obviously go hand in hand. So basically, what this means in the background is that CSS basically will create a object of this class and actually help it to style it. But then you say, okay, how do I then access this H1 class, right? So we can actually give it a name, and let's just say header. We can just say something like main dash header, right? So I'll also jump into like how you can actually name your classes in a second. So what we can just do is you can just simply copy this main header, right? Or you actually know the name. So we can just go to CSS. Right, and how do I then access my H1 tag over here, right? So we use something called the dot operator, and we just simply say main dash header, right? And we'll open your curly braces over here. So then the first things first, okay, what do we then want to do with this text? Let's just change the color for one, just to actually make sure that this actually works. So let's just say red, right? And if I press save and I go to my index as well as press save, I go to my browser, and if I hit refresh, wow, as you guys can see, now my text is now red, right? So now you guys can see how HTML and CSS, as I said, are husband and wife, and you can never, ever, ever divorce the two, because if you don't have the one, the other won't actually function, all right? So now that we know, so let's talk a bit about, class names. So now if I actually want to style my paragraph, right, as I said, I'll just assign a class to it. And you guys will also see as we're building our websites, we are always going to follow this procedure, right? We will always assign all of our elements and attributes to class names, right? So let's just call this paragraph 1. So in terms of classes, right, you can actually name your classes in any type of way, right? But in good programming practice, and when you go into industry, there's something called clean code, right? So you wouldn't want to actually have someone that has bad naming conventions, right? So you always want to first and foremost make sure that your naming conventions are not clear, proper, and actually make sense, right? So this is what we actually call as a bad naming convention, right? So what I mean, what is part 1? If you're working in a team and you give this this document to another programmer, they might actually be confused in terms of what are you actually trying to say, right? So best case scenario is that you always want to just make sure that you have good naming practices. Another thing is that you cannot have something like paragraph underscore 1, right? This is also considered as bad coding practices. However, if you feel like you want to have 2 names or 3 names or 4 names in one, there's something called the hyphen in between, right? And there is also a difference between main header space and header, right? What this actually means is that you are now telling HTML that I need you to go grab this style, the main style, as well as the header style, right? So CSS will actually interpret this as 3 different styling mechanisms instead of actually returning one, right? So if you that's why it's very important to when you're actually going to be naming your conventions, right? So let's actually find this and say, I can actually say paragraph 1. All right, so I could just simply copy this, and it's quite also important to make sure that the naming convention is quite important as well. And what I'll then do is I'll use my dot operator, I'll paste that, and I'll open that. And in this case, let's actually increase the size, right? So let's go with font size. So now, guys, as I said, with time, you'll actually remember all of these properties that I'm actually telling you about. I know like things like color, font size, padding, and all of that. There's really not much time that I can really dive into, telling you exactly every single property. I mean, the last time I checked, there was almost like 300 properties that CSS actually has. So it's quite important that obviously with coding, with practice and practice and practice, some of these properties will come second easy to you, right? And you'll be familiarized with them and so forth, right? So with the font size, let's change the font size to about 50 pixels, right? So px actually, this is one of the measurements that CSS actually uses to actually apply its measurements, right? So let's just say 50px, and we go to our browser, hit refresh, and you guys can see now, okay, now my paragraph has now increased in terms of size. So now you guys can see slowly but surely how we can actually start manipulating the data onto our website, right? So now one more thing that I actually want to show you guys before I think we can call it a day is that what if I then want to actually add an image? All right, so let's actually do that. So now in HTML, the keyword for adding an image is img. Now, as you guys always remember, I used to tell you, whenever you open a tag, you close a tag. But adding an image is a special case where we don't actually add a closing tag, right? But it's always important to just have a closing tag at the end. This is just also good programming practices, because you also see when you go into Django, in this case, it will give you an error if you just leave it like that. So with an image, just put a backslash, and that's it. That's it. So when we think about how we actually accessed our CSS file over here, it's exactly the same way we actually have to access and tell CSS, HTML that, hey, I want to actually render an image over here, but where do I get it? All right. So there's something called the SRC, which is actually just like the resource of my image, right? And you always have to put them in curly braces. And now let's look at where my image is. All right, so let's, for instance, I want to display this image. All right, so I just need to make sure that everything is in the same folder. All right, I double check. So now another thing you need to make sure is that you also need to make sure that the type of image, right? So the type image is also quite important. So here's the name of the image, which is 01, and the type is JPEG. All right, so we need to remember that as well. So we're just going to say 01.jpeg, and I save. Now, if I then go back to my browser and I hit refresh, okay, it's something. um, guys, can you also hear me? Hello, guys, can you hear me?
Yes, Cockatoo, we can hear you.
Okay. All right, so hello, hello.
Yes, Cockatoo, we still here.
Oh, I think, gosh, I think I got cut once again. So I think what I was saying was right. So you remember? Oh, so I think you guys didn't really hear what I was saying. Is that I actually had the JPEG, the E over here, but just to make double sure that your image is actually right, you can just always just double check with the properties, and it will always give you the extension, right? So this is the type, and sometimes the type does not actually match with the extension. So just to be just to be absolutely sure, if sometimes when you try to actually insert your image and it doesn't actually show, just double check with the properties, hit save, and then your image will actually render there. So the last thing I actually want to do is, if I want to then obviously access and change my image, as always, I always have to assign it to a class, and let's just call it image 1-1, right? We say over there. And if I come into my CSS, dot operator, image -1, open curly braces, and let's actually change the size as well, right? So we can just say let's look at the height. The height can be, let's just say 100 pixels, right? And then we're gonna have the width. The width, let's just make it 85 pixels. That's fine, 85 pixels. And if I save that, go back to my browser and I hit refresh, as you guys can now see that I have now styled my image. So I think you guys are actually getting the idea in terms of how CSS and HTML actually works hand in hand together. All right. So I know we are way past our time, but once again, just a quick recap is that today we spoke about HTML, we spoke about CSS, and then tomorrow, hopefully when we don't have issues again, we jump straight into the Django project. And guys, for now, I really want you guys to really start thinking about the kind of project or kind of website that you guys want to build, right? It's okay if you guys want to follow along with the website that I have in mind, but you guys are more than welcome to also just have your own in mind. So that being said, guys, thank you so much for today's session. Apologies once again for all the technical difficulties, but with tech, what can go wrong will go wrong. Thank you so much for your patience. And yeah, thank you so much as well to the iSet team.
Thank you so much, Koketso. That was one informative session. And from the iSet team, thank you for those that stayed up until the end of the session. I see only 6 participants left, but nonetheless, thank you so much, guys, for sticking with us. And then, Koketso, we shall see you tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys.
Thanks. Dumela, you can stop the recording.
All right, till tomorrow, guys, same time. And also just make sure that please also inform other people, students that are quite interested learning about web development using Django and Python. We only have tomorrow and Thursday, and by the end of Thursday, you guys will have a fully fledged project that you guys can show to your mates. So thank you so much once again.
Thanks, Koketso.
All right, take care, guys. See you guys all tomorrow.